Earlier this year, I built myself my very own garden workshop, and now it is finally time to start working on the inside. And what better place to start than building the heart of any workshop, the workbench. So grab yourself a cup of tea and join me as I take you on the journey that I went through to build what I believe is the ultimate small workbench.
What you want to do is start off by getting 2 sheets of plywood and cut them down the center.
Hold on a minute, let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before we start this build, you should know that my workshop is not huge. So going into this, I knew that I needed to hit upon 3 clear design objectives. Number 1, this needs to be suitable for a small workshop, which rules out doing one of those full sheets of plywood size benches. That isn't going to work. Number 2, in my opinion, any good workbench should house a table saw, which for me is the SAWSTOP Jobsite Pro. However, the design will allow you to customize it to fit any modern day table saw. And number 3, it needs to have storage coming out of the wazoo.
Wazoo is an English phrase meaning a lot. And spoiler alert,
this list ends up growing way too much throughout this video, but we'll get to that later. With all of these requirements, I knew that good planning was going to be key, so I meticulously scoured the internet looking for inspiration wherever I could.
Today I'm going to show how I made this table saw workbench.
Perfect hybrid workbench.
So you see why I might need a workbench?
And this is when I noticed that all of these workbenches seem to have one major thing in common. You see, when I was originally planning this workbench, I was going to have the table saw alongside the additional surface area as like an extra table to put a cup of tea or my pen. But it does seem far more useful and safe to use that additional surface area as an outfeed table for the saw. And with this epiphany fresh in my mind, I could now plan all of the dimensions, as well as buy all of the timber that I would need to actually build this thing. I opted for this 2x4 redwood for the frame and this 18mm thick Baltic birch plywood for the tops and the sides. Now, as you can imagine, building a base for this thing isn't particularly difficult. I started by cutting down the 4 sides of that basic rectangular frame on my miter saw. I then cut some of the plywood to fix on top. Well, screwing that plywood to the top was the original plan, but then I remembered design criteria number 3. I wanted a lot of storage. So in order to seep out every spare inch in every nook and cranny, I decided to embed that 18mm plywood into the frame itself. I did that by cutting away all of the corners on the table saw, which left a lovely gap for that plywood to sink under the surface area of the frame. And if you're wondering whether all of that effort is worth it to save 18mm,
Of course it is. And you know it.
once that plywood was set into the frame, I made sure to fill in these ugly little gaps that were remaining in the corners just to make it look a bit prettier. And then I could work on the supporting legs. And this is where you are going to have to commit to the overall height of your workbench. For me, I wanted this workbench to have a total height of 920mm off the ground, which meant that my legs needed to be just under that height to account for the 18mm plywood that would sit on top of it. For those following along at home, I do strongly advise that you do start off with 1/2 of the frame, specifically the side that will support your table saw. And I'm not going to overdo the explanations here. Essentially what I'm doing right now is building a box.
yes!
However, I will give you one word of caution, and that is that this did get quite tricky for me. And my top tip would be to make sure you have a bunch of clamps on standby just to support everything as you're going along. Also, I'm not showing it in any of the footage here, but just assume between all of these shots that I am checking for square as I go, and I'm sanding off all of those rough edges just to make sure that everything butts up together nice and snug. And with the first half of the frame out of the way, I could now cut some of that lovely plywood to fix to the top. I did decide to cut the plywood purposely too large on all of the sides at first. This would allow me to fix it using these 50mm wood screws and then trim it down using a flush trim bit on the router. With all of that said and done, I could now remove my table saw from its rolling stand just to make sure that everything fits. And I'm not going to lie, I was constantly double checking the measurements of that table saw and this frame that I was building. And it was only when I actually tested the table saw fit that I realized everything was okay. So this moment come as a big relief. For the taller side of the frame, you essentially are repeating the process. Cut down your longer supporting legs. I decided to attach them to the smaller half of the frame using both wood glue and these incredibly long wood screws that I had lying around. I think they were 120 mil long. And the main difference between this half of the frame versus the shorter one that you've just done for your table saw is that before you attach the top frame and your piece of plywood, you want to take advantage of that not being there and cut down your plywood to attach to the sides and the back. And after much consideration of how I would fix these plywood boards to the frame, in the end, I decided to go with the easiest option, which is using pocket hole screws. The reason for that is because you won't actually see any of these once everything is fully built. So I decided that I was happy with this approach. I did have to borrow a long clamp off a friend, which made installing these much easier. It meant that I could pull together the top of the frame as I was screwing these in, which stopped anything moving around, which can sometimes happen with these pocket screws. In the end, I used about 6 pocket screws on both sides of each piece of plywood, which felt really strong and it doesn't feel like these are going anywhere. And with those plywood sides attached, I could now finish the frame on the top and fix down that sheet of plywood. With all of my visible screw holes filled and sanded, things were really starting to come together. And it was at this point that it dawned on me that this thing weighs an absolute ton. Yeah, I can't lift that. That's too heavy. So it was pretty clear that I needed to add some wheels. And after perusing the internet and reading a ton of reviews, I finally settled on these from Amazon. These are rated to support up to 400 kilograms, which is way more than I actually needed, and the reviews were really good. Once they turned up, I attached them using the 6 screws that were included. And honestly, these worked way better than expected. As you can see here, I'm able to effortlessly push this thing around.
Oh my God, it works.
And that's a result. Now also seems like a great time to talk about dust extraction. Luckily, I did plan ahead for this, and behind the table saw, there is a decent gap of about 140 millimeters that should allow me to fit the necessary components to fit a dust extractor. I did reach out to the guys over at Yandles who suggested this 90-degree elbow as well as this adapter, which fitted the Jobsite Pro perfectly and means that I can now hook up my dust extraction very easily. And I do have some ideas of how I might improve this in the future. So if you're not already, please do hit that subscribe button so you don't miss that in a future video. At this point, the workbench was looking in very good shape. I just needed to address that massive gap under the tabletop and decide which approach would offer me the most accessible storage. And as far as I was concerned, it was either between shelves or drawers. On one hand, shelves are great because they offer you quick access to tools and timber without the need to open a cupboard door or pull on a drawer front. Whereas drawers do mean that you get good access to the entire space. So if you've got something stored right at the back, you don't have to move a load of other things to get access to it. On the other hand, shelves are far cheaper and easier to make because, well, you just need a shelf. Whereas drawers do require a lot more timber and you need the drawer runners and handles as well. In the end, I splashed the cash and decided that drawers were the only way to go.
And this is where I've got a little confession to make.
I have never actually made drawers, so this was a new experience for me. But it turns out that they are actually really simple to make. First, you need to cut down the 4 sides of your drawer on your table saw. It's a workshop, it's going to happen. Don't make your ceiling too nice. So originally I was going to have just 2 drawers, but I think I'm going to opt for 3 different drawers. I don't think I'm going to have enough plywood though, and I do really want to avoid buying another 18mm sheet of this because it is really expensive. So I do have some of this 9mm plywood that's obviously a lot cheaper that I'm going to use for the actual base of the drawers because you won't see that. It's also got some cool writing on it. So the next thing I need to do now that I know these are the right size is just cut out a little channel at the bottom of each of them, just so that base layer of plywood can actually slot into here. So I'm going to set the table saw up so the blade sticks at 6mm and just take that out, each of them up to 9mm wide. I could then connect 3 of those sides using pocket screws. Slide in that 9mm base that I had cut earlier. And lock everything into place by connecting that 4th remaining side. Now, all that was left to do was to fix each drawer into place using these drawer runners. Again, I'll have a link to all of the hardware that I used in the description of this video. Obviously, all that was left to do then was make the remaining drawers, so I repeated this process. I didn't really plan ahead for how tall I wanted each of the drawers to be. I just knew that the bottom drawer I wanted to be tall enough to actually fit my impact driver and drill, which it does. And then I made each of the other 2 drawers slightly smaller than the previous, obviously making the 3rd and final drawer fit the gap that was remaining. With those 3 drawers in, all that was left to do is cut a drawer front for each of them, clamp them down and attach them using those same pocket screws. And in order to squeeze out every last possible piece of storage on this workbench, I also decided to add this lovely little shelf on the back of it, which is a handy place to store any oils or other tools that I might need quick access to. I finished everything off with a final light sand and a couple of coats of teak oil, and there you have it, the ultimate small workbench. If you do want to make this workbench yourself, then you can purchase the plans in the description of this video. And if you enjoyed this video, then please do subscribe. This one really did take a long time. And until next time, happy building.